If you're watching this video, you have essentially an endless supply of clean water at the pull of a lever. And because this is so easy, we tend to forget just how critical water is for us. You can live 3 weeks without food, but only a few days without water. It's a total bummer that nearly 1 billion people around the world don't have access to clean drinking water. Today, drinking contaminated water causes more deaths than HIV, AIDS, and malaria combined.
We know the #1 pollutant to water is the lack of sanitation. It's the #2 killer of children worldwide under 5. Hundreds of thousands of liters of untreated waste are getting dumped into the Ganges every single day. This is happening in every waterway in the world. When cholera was introduced in Haiti, one untreated toilet killed 10,000 people and have sickened 500,000 people. So we know it's time to deal with this.
And so that's why the powder in this packet is a really big deal. It was invented by a guy named Philip Suter. He's a laundry scientist at Procter & Gamble who's originally trying to figure out a way to separate dirt from used laundry water. This powder you could add to super muddy water like this, and then you stir it up, and 5 minutes later, the mud has separated from the pure, clean, drinkable water. And I want to be clear here, they are not sponsoring this video in any way. I just think what they're doing is really awesome and they deserve some credit. So I was actually able to track Philip down and he told me all about how it worked.
So essentially there's 3 processes. There's coagulation, then the next phase is flocculation, and then the last piece is the disinfection.
You start with clean water like this, but now it's all brown because it's filled with lots of dirt particles, parasites, and bacteria. So you dump the powder in the water, and as Phil explained, the coagulant part of the powder goes to work first. It's basically seed crystals that are positively charged, and because the dirt in the water is negatively charged, these seed crystals act like dirt magnets. And these dirt magnets grow until they're each about 1 millimeter in size. The next part of the powder to activate is the flocculant, which is a polymer which you can think about as having huge long arms that wrap up all the little dirt magnet clumps, and now they form bigger chunks as large as 1 centimeter. And these chunks now are so big, they're just slightly more dense than the water, which means they sink to the bottom. And finally, the chlorine is released, and it goes to work on killing the 99.9999% of all the really tiny viruses and bacteria that are left in the water that didn't get wrapped up and sink to the bottom. So now you're just left with safe drinking water at the top. And this isn't just some PR stunt for P&G. Since 2004, millions of people in over 90 countries have used these packets, and they've saved untold thousands upon thousands of lives.
This is a very basic overview of the water treatment process. Customers always need water, but rainfall is seasonal and increasingly unpredictable. So we often use storage reservoirs to make sure there's always a supply for treatment. By passing water through mesh screens, we remove sticks, water weeds and other large foreign objects. The air takes some odours and gas from the water and allows some dissolved metal salts to separate to be filtered out. We add air by cascading the water down a tower, spraying it into the air or bubbling air through it. At this stage, there are still some fine pieces of matter suspended in the water, along with colour and bacteria. We add a precisely controlled amount of a coagulant like ferric or aluminium sulfate. This reacts with the material in water, making it all stick together to form what's known as floc. To make this flocculation happen, water and the coagulant have to be mixed together very quickly and thoroughly in a special device called a flash mixer. Next comes the clarification process. The floc forms itself into sludge and is separated in a specially designed tank called a clarifier. This sludge layer is called the sludge blanket. To control the blanket, sludge is periodically drained off, concentrated and removed for safe disposal. Particles filtered out on the RGF, the rapid gravity filter, are removed by backwashing. The water now needs filtration to get rid of any remaining particles. Water is filtered slowly through very fine sand or sand-like material. For some river waters, we use ozone gas injection as a treatment stage. This can work in conjunction with GAC or granular activated carbon treatment, where the water is filtered through carbon granules to take out any undesirable traces of largely natural organic materials. The carbon in these filters is removed and regenerated by heat so it can be used again. Now the water's filtered and thoroughly cleaned, it's disinfected to make sure no harmful bacteria remain. A small, controlled amount of chlorine is the most effective method. The chlorine has to stay in contact with the water for a period of time for effective disinfection. Last but not least, adjustments are made to the pH levels of the water during the treatment process so that it's neither too acid or alkaline. This helps pipework, fittings and the water itself. From the treatment works, water is fed into a huge mains pipe network. This grid is then accessed directly to your home, and when you turn your tap on, it's available to you. Clean, safe drinking water.
These packets cost them pennies to make, which they sell at a loss, and that feels like the right thing to do. But it brings up the question, is there a case to be made beyond altruism, where it's in the best interest of the rich countries to help out the poor countries?
Meet Doris.
Hello.
Doris works in a low-paying job in a developing country. To drink, cook and clean, Doris needs at least 50 liters of water every day, but it costs a massive slice of her daily income. 25% in Accra, Ghana, 45% in Antananarivo, Madagascar, and 54% in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Why are the poorest paying such a high price?
Today, Brits can take comfort in having a long life expectancy. UK men fall at a solid 79 years, while women have a slightly longer expectancy at 83. However, back in the Industrial Revolution, the middle class clocked out at an average age of 45. English factory workers were lucky to make it to 30 years old. Laborers were exposed to a wide assortment of toxins and disease at much higher rates than those not working in poorly regulated factory conditions. Factor in how easily disease was spread from person to person, plus neglected water sources and general overpopulation, the situation was ripe for widespread infections. And boy, was there. Cholera was a real problem in 19th century England, with 4 separate cholera outbreaks that would take the lives of almost 15,000 people in London alone. The disease, which was rather fatal during this time, was easily spread due to poor water treatment management in the UK, hence the rapid rise of horrible diseases through contaminated water. Cholera wasn't infecting the streets of the UK alone, however. Typhus and typhoid were running these streets as well. Typhoid also spread through poorly treated water, hung out in the county's well water, and caused flu-like symptoms. Typhus was spread through lice. During and after the Industrial Revolution, most of England's drinking water came from rivers, which were often contaminated with sewage and garbage. In 1854, Dr. John Snow hunted down a pump in London that was responsible for a particularly brutal outbreak of cholera that struck down 500 people in only 10 days. By mapping out the deaths, he was able to find and isolate the pump. Despite the notably deteriorating conditions, the UK sort of dragged its heels to pass any meaningful legislation to end the health crisis caused by lack of sanitation. But it wasn't for the lack of anybody bringing it to their attention. In 1842, reformer Edwin Chadwick, British sanitation advocate, released a report succinctly entitled Report on the Sanitary Conditions of Laboring Population of Great Britain. In it, he argued that the living conditions of Britain's poorest working class were extremely subpar and tied the relationship between living in squalor and spreading disease. This pitch, however convincing, went nowhere until 1848 with the passing of the first British Public Health Act. In Chadwick's 1842 proposal, he presented the idea of not living in squalor as a way to save the government some change by knocking poor people off of government assistance. Many families at the time relied on government funds and services after losing family members to a myriad of infectious diseases. It would take yet another cholera outbreak in 1848 before the government implemented the act, which included a framework for towns to have medical doctors, proper sewage, trash disposal, and clean drinking water. In other words, fully functioning safe cities. With neither the money nor the oversight to administer these regulations, however, it was mostly meaningless words on paper. It was ultimately up to local jurisdictions to impose the act in their cities, but there was nothing to necessarily compel them to do so, assuming that people getting cholera all the time wasn't enough. It was widely accepted that disease was spread through miasma, or bad smells. Rather than go to the source of the foul odors, doctors focused on the odors themselves. Even our friend Chadwick, who wrote some of the most important reports in legislation about sanitation, was a big believer in it's the smells that are the real problem. Under his watch, refuse was dumped into the Thames River to curb the odors plaguing London. It backfired in epic, unfortunate fashion. After centuries of using the river as a waste dump, one particularly hot summer created what was known as the Great Stink of 1858.
Now, there's a lot of debate over whether things started to get done because people actually cared about the plight of the poor, or if they were afraid of a popular uprising if conditions didn't get a little better, or if they actually just thought that more sanitary conditions meant fewer sick poor people, which meant that this was a way to make the poor cost the government less money. But no matter what the cause, things started to get done. And in fact, the creation of local boards of health, like the very group that John Snow presented his findings to get the pump handle in Broad Street removed, were a direct result of some of the legislation precipitated by Chadwick's report. But in addition to forming local boards of health, this idea of creating sanitary cities went much further. They introduced sewers, real sewers, the kind we think of today. In fact, many of our major sewer systems today are the systems they built during this time. Although John Snow wouldn't live to see it, the London sewer system which his work helped to inspire, built in 1859, is still what our giant modern city of London uses today. And you know what? That horrible specter, that demon cholera that John Snow spent his entire life fighting, the sewer system vanquished it. London would see only one more cholera epidemic after the Broad Street outbreak that John Snow so valiantly tried to contain, and this final outbreak happened in the one part of London where the sewer system hadn't yet been completed. Luckily, this last epidemic was quickly attacked by a man named William Farr, the very same man who John Snow would so often pester at the Registrar General's office for statistics. He had learned from Snow and believed his theory, and he used Snow's methods to limit the outbreak of cholera in 1866. After that epidemic, cholera in London would be no more. And this may sound like a simple thing. I mean, we rarely ever think about the sewers flowing under our feet. But these sanitation projects were some of the greatest public works projects ever attempted. The London system alone had to run 13,000 miles of pipe to see this project completed. That's roughly half the circumference of the Earth. They laid 318 million bricks and dug out 2.7 million cubic meters of dirt from the streets of London just to put this sewer system in. In Europe, major parts of cities were sometimes simply torn down and rebuilt whole cloth around more sanitary lines. In Chicago, they literally lifted the city up by 4 feet and put the sewer system underneath it. But in the end, these massive efforts had an effect. Not only was cholera defeated, but things like typhoid and typhus were massively reduced, paving the way for the giant economic engines that we think of as today's cities.
Any sanitation system that doesn't treat waste locally in developing countries should be illegal. It's not enough to have a sanitation system that's just collection. You have to treat waste locally, affordably. You can't hike it in and out everywhere. We have a responsibility with what we've done to the earth to not cause any more problems. Every solution now has to address multiple problems.
150 years since the Great Stink in the developing world, billions of people are living and dying in the kind of squalor that was eradicated long ago in the rich world. 2.6 billion people lack access to basic sanitation, and over 1 billion lack access to clean water. There is a global crisis in sanitation and water, and it undermines all development efforts. The stink goes on.